First of all, I think the crackdown took place. The reason is these 78 people were arrested.
In the early months of 2003, the Cuban government arrested 75 Cuban citizens on charges of subversion and collaborating with U.S. diplomats. The American press followed the story through the trial and characterized the subsequent sentences as harsh and draconian. They covered international outrage and quoted American officials and Cuban exiles and dissidents extensively, but most media outlets gave only minimal coverage to the Cuban side of the story. U.S. lawmakers accused Fidel Castro of using the American invasion of Iraq as a distraction, which coincided with events in Cuba. They often referred to these measures and recent executions of 3 convicted hijackers as if they were the same event, creating the impression of even greater brutality and eliciting more outrage and domestic public opinion. Little attention was given as to why the sudden crackdown after years of relative tolerance. Why would the Cuban government put their fragile international trade relations at peril? Although Foreign Minister Felipe Perez Roque presented his government's position in great detail in a press conference on April 9th, it received virtually no coverage in the American media. Was there more to the story than the U.S. press was reporting?
The reason that the crackdown took place, the reason these 78 people were arrested, is because they represented a legitimately independent and authentically nationwide organization that was not controlled by the state. And the state's reaction to that was to crush it. We know, we who live in democracies know that democratic development isn't about an election, and it isn't about 1, 2, or 20 parties. What it is about authentically are the hundreds and thousands and millions of grassroots transactions which take place by authentically independent representatives of civil society. The Cuban government's reaction to that kind of authentic independence is to crush it and put people in jail.
¿Qué se ha pasado?
What happened?
Porque no,
really happened.
Te hablo de los que fuimos fusilados, pero además detuvimos 74 personas.
But we detained 74 persons.
En Estados Unidos dice que son intelectuales cubanos.
In the United States, they say they are Cuban
Eso
intellectuals.
es mentira.
That's a lie.
Una mentira flagrante.
That's a big lie.
Son asalariados de la
They
embajada
are
norteamericana en La Habana.
people earning a salary from the American interest section in Havana.
Pero además tenemos pruebas de eso.
But we have proof, and we have proof.
Es muy
of this.
simpático porque teníamos
It's
9
funny, but because 9 of them
compañeros de la inteligencia
they
cubana
were from the Cuban intelligence,
que formaban parte de los grupos esos.
and they were like people belonging to the groups.
Y sabían cuando le pagaban,
And they knew what they
cuándo le
were
pagaban,
paid, the
cómo le pagaban
amount
el
they
dinero,
were paid, how they were
qué le
paid,
orientaban a hacer
what they
para crear una situación de inestabilidad interna en Cuba.
tell them to create an unstable
O sea,
situation in
esas
Cuba.
personas que detuvimos
All
no
these
son,
people-
no son disidentes,
We are imprisoned. They are not dissidents.
son traidores.
They are traitors.
Well, if you go to the website of AID, the Agency for International Development, you'll see a list of payments made to organizations which support activities in Cuba. The Cuban government says that they found receipts for payments on some of the people who were arrested. AID is not hiding these payments. They're proud of it.
First of all, let me say I think the crackdown is deplorable and is a mistake on the part of the Cubans, a mistake which I hope they will reconsider. But the crackdown did not come about as a result of any liberalization on the part of the United States, any easing of our policy towards Cuba. Quite the contrary. The crackdown came about, I think, for a number of reasons. The most direct, perhaps, was indeed the provocations on the part of Mr. Kaysen, holding seminars and passing out mimeograph machines and so forth to dissidents in his residence, and saying that the reason for these meetings and various other meetings he was holding around the island, that the reason was to bring about the rapid transition to a more representative form of government. Well, we would all like to see a more open system in Cuba, but a diplomat does not say that he is carrying on meetings in order to bring about a change of government. I mean, that steps over the diplomatic line. Officers in the State Department may say that it doesn't, but I would invite them to go back and read the manual in Diplomacy 101A. And I would also invite them to ask themselves what would happen if the chief of the Cuban interest section here in Washington were holding meetings with groups of disgruntled Americans, you know, maybe disgruntled because they don't have health insurance, and saying that the reason for these meetings was to bring about the rapid transition to socialism in the United States. He wouldn't last a day. He would be immediately declared PNG, persona non grata.
I don't know what Kaysen is doing. I mean, I mean, to me, if one, I never would have appointed him as the head of our interest section or as president. Two, I'd fire him after this latest gaffe, and I think it is a gaffe. I mean, you know, we can get up here in the United States House of Representatives all we want and pound our fists and say how unjust it was that Castro arrested all those people, and it is. But you know what? I mean, they wouldn't be in jail today if Kaysen would have been more of a diplomat. You know, if he would have taken a very different approach, if he wouldn't have tainted the legitimate efforts of some of these people who are struggling and fighting for democracy by putting them on the U.S. payroll. I'm not quite sure what his purpose is or what his goal is. I mean, if his purpose was to eliminate, you know, any dissent in Cuba, he succeeded. You know, all the people he gave money to are in jail. I don't know how that serves the cause of democracy in Cuba. I don't know how that opens up political space, but that's what he succeeded in doing because of his in-your-face approach.
Moreover, the Cuban government had shown a growing tolerance of dissent in the years before the crackdown. Elisardo Sanchez, the leading human rights activist, came to the United States a number of times, gave speeches or made statements in the United States. The Cuban government may not have liked what he said, but he wasn't punished when he went home. When President Carter went to Cuba a year ago, he met with the dissidents. He mentioned the Varela Project. That was broadcast to the Cuban nation, was published in the press the next day. Nothing happened to those who had put forward the Varela Project. In fact, Osvaldo Payá, the principal architect of the Varela Project, was allowed to come to the United States to receive the Averell Harriman Award, then went to Europe, received other awards, and again, the Cuban government may not have liked what he had to say while he was abroad because he was calling for greater freedoms and so forth. But he was not punished when he went home. In other words, there was a growing atmosphere of tolerance. But rather than responding to that by suggesting a dialogue, perhaps some steps to improve relations, the Bush administration continued its hard line, continued the provocations from the U.S. interest section, and we get the crackdown rather than continuing the continuing trend towards greater tolerance.